Okay, so I think good evening. I think we'll get started. It's 6:01, so just people are going to settle as I introduce the evening. I'm sorry, the mic? Okay. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. So good evening, and those of you who are joining us online, perhaps also good afternoon if you are joining us from the West Coast. I'm Magda Tedder. I'm the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies here at Fordham University and the co-director of the Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. I am very pleased to welcome you to our first event in a four-part series titled How Did We Get Here? A deep dive into the history of Israel and Palestine with Hussein, Ibish, and David N. Myers. Today's session is titled Arabs and Jews, 1881 to 1948, and it seeks to explore the early encounter of this long and difficult history and conflict. Our speakers, Dr. Hussein Ibish and Dr. David Myers, are no strangers to Fordham. In 2017 and 2018, in this very room, we hosted them as part of what was then our In Dialogue lecture series in Jewish Studies, in which scholars in different fields discussed together a topic of common interest, approaching it from their different angles. This series then was inspired by the premise of dialogue articulated over 50 years ago in the seminal, actually nearly 60 years ago, in the seminal Declaration Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council, grounded in mutual knowledge. Given this tradition, Fordham, as a Jesuit university, is ideally positioned to engage in a thoughtful and considerate discussions on the most complex topics. And over the years, we have not shied away from difficult subjects. Today, there is perhaps no more complex and fraught topic than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The shocking Hamas massacre in southern Israel, the scope of which is still not fully known, and the ensuing war that has left thousands dead, wounded, and emotionally scarred, has dominated news headlines and social media these past 2 months. The conflict, including its harrowing images and heartbreaking consequences, has shown a unique capacity to pull us in emotionally, to mobilize global protests, and to make so many individuals and communities, even those far from the war itself, feel vulnerable and afraid. But hashtags and emotions do not lead to a better understanding of this complex, protracted, and bloody conflict. In fact, they tend to have the opposite effect. They lead to entrenchment and confusion rather than to in-depth understanding of the conflict, its history, and the current moment. They ultimately obscure rather than promote the ultimate goal of resolution, justice, and peace. Our students, grieving and anguished by what they have been all seeing, have been gathering to pray and mourn. Just last week, the Jewish Students Organization, Muslim Student Organization, Campus Ministry, and the Interfaith Council hosted an interfaith prayer vigil for remembrance, healing, and hope. Our students have also been asking to learn more. Talking about this history feels like a minefield. Thus, Fordham Center for Jewish Studies has partnered with the Center on Religion and Culture, the Department of History, the International Studies Program, and the Middle Eastern Studies Program in order to offer a series of learning opportunities to help us understand not only the long history of the conflict, but also how specific historical events are understood often differently by those involved in it. I'm grateful to our partners for co-sponsoring this program and to our students whose curiosity, interest, and commitment to learning have motivated this program. I'm also grateful to all those who made this event happen, including the Gabelli School of Business for welcoming us into their building, and the Gabelli School of Business IT and Media team, without whom we couldn't be doing it. Many thanks to those of you in this room and to those of you joining us online, and special thanks to our two speakers, Hussein Ibish and David Myers. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and he's a weekly columnist for The National and previously served as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine. David Myers is a distinguished professor and Sady and Ludwig Kahn Chair of Jewish History at UCLA. He directs the UCLA Luskin Center for for History and Policy, which produces absolutely fantastic podcasts then and now on the relevance of history, so you should find it. And he also directs the UCLA initiative to study hate. David Myers is a distinguished scholar of modern Jewish history, including the history of Zionism and historiography, and is the author and editor of many books, including The Stakes of History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life. In a moment, I will hand over the stage to our speakers. After that, we'll have time for questions. In the interest of time, however, we ask you to use this QR code and submit questions online by scanning it. We hope to address as many of them as possible this evening. Next semester, we'll continue with 3 additional sessions scheduled for January, February, and March, and we hope you'll join us for the full series. Students who complete the whole program and write a short reflection paper will receive a book in the history of the conflict after the last event in March. For we hope that this series prompts us all to continue learning again. So without further ado, David and Hussein, I'm very honored to have you back at campus, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you so much, Magda. Can you hear me? Great. So it's really a great pleasure to be with you, although the circumstances, of course, could be a bit more felicitous than they are. I'd like to begin by thanking my dear friend and colleague, Professor Magda Tetter, for her gracious invitation and hospitality, Professor Sarit Katan-Gribitz for her involvement in this program, and of course Shaban for all of the work. Shaban? Yeah? Okay, so we're going to hold off on the lavalier. Okay. Thank you all for having us back at Fordham. We had imagined doing this series before October 7th, as Magda suggested. And that seemed like a very good idea. And of course, it seems like a good idea now, but in a different way. We're in the midst of such a terribly fraught time, a time of extraordinary sensitivity, as Magda suggested in her opening remarks, a period marked by the still almost unimaginable shock and horror of October 7th, compounded, of course, by the almost unimaginable devastation that has befallen Palestinians in Gaza. And one of the things that I think unites Hussein and me is our capacity to understand the horror, both of October 7th and the aftermath. I mean, I think that's going to be a hallmark of our approach, our attempt to understand the history of the conflict that we're going to divide into 4 parts with a mix of critical distance and empathy. That's sort of the balancing act that we're really striving to attain as we understand the history of Arabs and Jews, of Israelis and Palestinians, of Israel and Arab states. We're going to do that over the course of 4 sessions. We're going to try to understand the nature and depth of the enmity and hostility that are so vital to constituting this conflict. And I should just add that that very term is a contested one. That very term is contested because some would suggest that it implies or connotes a degree of symmetry in terms of power between the two sides, when in fact there is very considerable asymmetry. But I would suggest that when one looks at the history over the course of the 120 years of the conflict, one sees, first of all, just shifting dynamics, power dynamics throughout, and frequent violence, constitutive violence, that cyclical violence, that together lead me to suggest that the term conflict indeed is an appropriate one. I'm now going to yield the podium to Hussein, who's going to offer some brief opening remarks, and then we're going to jump right in with the first part of the program.
Thanks, David. Yeah. I'm just going to pick up where David left off, and thank you, Magda and Fordham, for bringing us back here. This couldn't be more urgent because, as David said, this is a conflict, and a continuous one that's been going on for either 100 or 120 years, perhaps even longer, depending on how you were to trace it. Wouldn't be much more than that. But I think it's obvious that what's been happening since October 7th is the biggest eruption of violence, the most intense eruption of violence during the entire history of the conflict. Never have so many people been killed so viciously and so quickly on both sides. It's extraordinary. I mean, you've got what used to take years and years. For example, the Second Intifada, which traumatized both peoples and changed their politics for good, was crammed into about a 3-week period. And now we've gone way past that, which is really extraordinary. So this, to understand what's happening now, I think we really do have to unpack the narratives. I mean, how do these people see each other? The Palestinians who poured over the Gaza border are not just any Palestinians. The population of Gaza are 95% refugees. And they're not refugees from anywhere in Israel. They're refugees from exactly the areas that they attacked. In other words, when they attacked those very peaceful, very liberal, very pro-peace communities in southern Israel, what they saw was not peace-minded Israelis, but rather the people who took their homes, or the homes of their grandparents and parents. The rage is more than ideological, more than religious. It's personal in a way that it usually isn't. And I think you can tell from the Israeli response that there's a visceral reaction here. The human animals, the human scum, they're all responsible. There are no civilians on the other side. We hear this kind of iteration a great deal. So to unpack that, I think we need to look at how the narratives informed this degree of dehumanization that we're dealing with, that's informing this worst part of a very long-running conflict. And I think that's what we want to try to achieve today. And our messaging will take us through to 1948, and we'll see at that point the two great fears being revisited now. Dead Israelis in the street, dead Jews, killed because they were Jews, right? On the one hand. And then in Gaza today, the sight of hundreds of thousands of people putting whatever they have on their backs and running from one place to another is the most iconic Palestinian image you can imagine. Grab what you can and run. And that's sort of the Nakba. It's the image of the Nakba versus the image of the Holocaust, basically. And I think it's really important that we peel this onion apart really carefully.
So in just a minute, we're going to jump right in, but I forgot to put up this slide, which captures what Hussein just spoke about. And I want to just name in perhaps more precise terms what Hussein was just talking about. The persistence of intergenerational trauma and the intersection of huge collective traumas that stand at the center of two peoples. this is in no small part an essential frame for the conversation we're about to have and to an understanding of what is taking place today. All right, so tonight what we plan to do is go back in time, about 140 years in time, and begin our story with the advent of the Zionist movement, which I'll begin in just a minute. We then want to make our way up to another key moment in the history of the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And tonight's presentation will begin in 1882 and end in 1948, that seminal year in the history of the relationship and the conflict. So these are the three key moments that we'll be covering tonight. In thinking of the origins of the relationship and conflict between Jews and Arabs, one has to begin with a discussion of the Zionist movement, understood by its participants as the movement for Jewish national liberation. One of the key precipitants to the advent of the Zionist movement was the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the sovereign of the Russian Empire in the year 1881, which prompted a series of anti-Jewish riots known as pogroms throughout particularly southern Russia, in parts of the empire where there were large numbers of Jews. And it's important to note that the Russian Empire was the site of the largest concentration of Jews in the world until the 20th century. What this convulsion of violence that followed the assassination of the Tsar, and it's important to add parenthetically that a member of the assassination team happened to be a Jew who was held responsible in the name of her people for the assassination at large. This act helped to trigger, was not the sole cause, but helped to trigger a series of emigrations out of the Russian Empire, or out of the place to which Jews had been confined hitherto in that area known as the Pale of Settlement. What we perhaps are most familiar with is the exit of Jews from the Russian Empire to the United States and the Americas, a migratory flow that lasted from 1882 to 1924 and brought some 2.5 million Jews to the United States, and hundreds of thousands to other parts of the Americas, including South America. A second important migratory stream, certainly in statistical terms, was that of Jews from the Pale of Settlement to Russian cities. The urbanization of Russian Jewry that occurs in the late 19th century was given a significant push by that series of violent acts in the wake of the assassination of the Tsar. But the migratory stream we want to focus on most tonight at this early moment is that which prompted a small number of Jews to make their way to the land of Israel. And this stream has been identified as the first wave of Zionist immigration to the land of Israel, the first Aliyah. Beginning in 1882, immediately shortly after the assassination of the Tsar and the outbreak of the pogroms. What animated this small number of Jews, in the small number of thousands, was a long-standing impulse that was embedded in Jewish historical consciousness and liturgy, known by the Hebrew term Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. The idea that Zion, the land of Israel, was the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people animated these settlers to, these prospective settlers, to make their way to this place and in many ways revitalize the Jewish national body and soul in its most hospitable site. This impulse to return to Zion was reflected in one of the first movements that captured this Zionist impulse. It's important to note that the term Zionism did not exist at this point in time, but one of the founding organizations that reflected the sensibilities of these emigres was the movement known as Chibat Zion, the love of Zion, whose founding conference took place in 1884. And over the course of this first wave of immigration from 1882 to the early 20th century, about 25,000 Jews, largely from the Russian Empire, made their way to Palestine or the land of Israel. A fair number of them, it should be noted, returned because what they found was not exactly what they had imagined, or what they had hoped for didn't turn out to be the case. One of the things that Zionists who made their way to the land of Israel, to Palestine in this first wave, Zionists without the name Zionism, didn't know much about was the presence of a local indigenous population. Some, however, did, and were duly mindful of the fact that there was a large indigenous population that was likely not to be especially welcoming of the new arrivals. And one of the most interesting and I think exemplary reflections of a Zionist figure who was aware of the presence of a large Palestinian Arab population was the great Zionist thinker Ahad Ha'am, the great Hebrew essayist and founder of what is known as cultural Zionism, who visited Palestine and wrote a series of quite interesting essays based on his visit, one of which was called Truth from Eretz Israel, Emet mi Eretz Israel, from 1891. And it's interesting to see what he wrote and what he saw. So he says, "We are accustomed to believing that the Arabs are all desert savages like donkeys, but this is a big mistake. The Arabs, like all children of Shem, the Arab, like all children of Shem, has a sharp intellect and is very cunning. The Arabs, and especially those in the cities, understand our deeds and our desires in Eretz Israel, but they keep quiet and pretend not to understand. Yet they mock us in their hearts." So one of the things that this reveals is, I think, a very characteristic European colonial Orientalist attitude towards the indigenous population of Palestine. Not at all atypical of a European visitor. But what's important to note is that Ahad Ha'am is aware that there is a local Palestinian Arab population. And it is something that settlers to the land of Israel, Jewish settlers coming from Europe, are not going to be able to ignore. They're going to have to contend with it. That view, I'm not exactly sure what happened here. Let me try presentation one. Oh, okay, there we go. Wow, amazing. Yeah, I did it. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I can't see here, but that's okay. Okay, so Ahad Ha'am was offered his insights on what challenges might face this new movement of settlers that did not yet have a name. The movement comes to have a name through the work of this person, Theodor Herzl, the founder of another strand of Zionism known as political Zionism. Herzl, unlike Ahad Ha'am, who was an Eastern European Jew rooted in traditional Jewish culture and the Hebrew language, was a largely assimilated Central European Jew born in Budapest who moved to Vienna, who was quite agitated about the Jewish condition, or as it was known in its time, the Jewish question in Central Europe in a time of rising anti-Semitism. Indeed, the term was invented in the very period in which Herzl operated. A little bit before, but he came of age in a period that was dominated by reflections about what assimilated European society would do with Jews who seemed unassimilable. And Herzl began to reflect on the question, where might the Jews find a solution to this predicament? And he especially thought about this in the wake of the Dreyfus affair in France in 1894, when a French Jewish army captain was falsely accused of espionage. In the wake of that false accusation and the huge storm of controversy that was generated after it, Herzl sat in a period of kind of depression and then frenetic energy and hammered out a vision in a very short period of time in 1895, during which he wrote a small book called The State of the Jews, often translated as The Jewish State, but better translated as The State of the Jews. A pamphlet that laid out the vision that the solution for the Jewish question was the creation of a self-standing state for Jews. Published in 1896. In this next year, Herzl, together with colleagues, founded the Zionist organization at what was called the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, and thus this movement that began with a small migratory stream in the early 1880s now had a name and an organizational framework. This was the Zionist movement. Just two important features of it at this point in time. First, it included a stream that was committed to the settlement project, as we've discussed just a minute ago, and a stream that was devoted, particularly through Herzl's own force of personality, to diplomatic efforts, to gaining international recognition for this fledgling movement. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Hussein. Magda, do you have any idea how we can see here too? That would be helpful. Sorry to...
Okay,
You'll just have to turn...
that's all right.
Okay.
I'll deal. Thank you. All right, so while all of this is going on, it really doesn't matter. While all of this is going on in Europe, among the Jews of Europe, the land in question is part of the Ottoman Empire, which is broken up into states, vilayats, local governorates based around large cities. So there's the Vilayat of Jerusalem, there's part of the Vilayat of Beirut, etc. And all of it in a broader context of Bilad Sham, the lands of Damascus, the sort of Levantine Arab countries. And the population is almost entirely Arab Muslims and Christians, but without an independent identity. And much of the population was and remained for the early part of the conflict pretty much not engaged with what was happening around them politically. Lots of peasants, lots of people who are not literate, lots of rural people who are not particularly informed. One of the things we're going to discover is that in this early phase of what becomes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Jewish or Israeli side is largely self-selected. Although as time goes on, people get born into it, right? But at this stage, people are self-selecting. They're deciding to go to Palestine. There's an indigenous Jewish community, but it's not very big. What we're really talking about is people going from Europe mainly to Palestine on a project, on a specific or a set of projects. The Palestinians, on the other hand, are just there. They're not self-selecting at all. They didn't sign up for any of this. They're just there. And it's fascinating to watch the extent to which first the elites and then the general public very slowly become aware of actually what's happening to them. And at this point, before World War I, they're almost all kind of Arab citizens of the Ottoman Empire, but there is a stirring of Arab nationalism in the Ottoman Empire, which Palestinians, proto-Palestinians, sort of who are in the elite, kind of participate in, some of them. Others remain loyally Ottoman subjects. There's a mixture. That's true, in all of the Ottoman Empire, in all of the Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire. And there's an extent to which, there's a slowness to react because they're trying to figure out what's going on. What is this? What does this mean? And I hope I know how to do this. Yes. So Youssef Khalidi is one of the first Palestinians, significant Palestinians, to engage with the Zionist movement. Youssef Khalidi he comes from a very prominent Palestinian family. He was the mayor of Jerusalem off and on many times between about 1870 and 1906. He was a Palestinian delegate to the Ottoman Parliament, and he was heavily engaged in Ottoman politics. And I'll tell you how he identified. He identified as a Palestinian in terms of his country and an Ottoman in terms of his state. So do with that what you will. The importance of Khalidi is that he undertook to write to Herzl, and his letter actually reached Herzl's secretary and was then passed on to Herzl in French. And what Khalidi said was, in a nutshell, I understand your project, I understand your claims. Your claims are based in history, they're legitimate, but you have to understand there's a people here, there is a culture here, we're not going to be able to reconcile your aims and our realities. And there's a famous line in this letter, for God's sake, leave Palestine alone. And that, of course, did not happen. But I think he got the gist of what was coming rather early. And Herzl wrote back to him basically saying nothing doing, just to put no finer point on it. What ends up happening is that, you're going to do this part, right? Okay. What ends up happening is that after a lot of negotiating between different parties, negotiating with the Ottoman Empire, which Herzl didn't really get anywhere, mainly because Palestinians and others were agitating against it, negotiating with Germany, with Imperial Germany, and getting somewhere. But finally, the big breakthrough with Britain was the Balfour Declaration, which we'll get to. The British kind of made taking over Palestine an important part for both strategic and cultural reasons of their campaign in World War I. And they overran the Ottomans in a very complicated way, and ultimately entered Jerusalem after the Battle of Jerusalem in December of 1917. General Allenby, who was the conqueror essentially, got off of his horse and walked humbly, in the footsteps of Jesus, whatever, that kind of thing, into Jerusalem and took firm control. So there's this great, some mixture of humility and absolute authority there. And Britain becomes the key factor in this area until the end of World War II. And we're going to begin now with the Balfour Declaration, which is crucial. Yeah. You're going to go first.
Right. So I mentioned that the Zionist movement was really a dual-track movement at the outset. It included both the settlement project of that first wave of immigration. In fact, the first two waves of immigration were deeply committed to settling the land as a project of physical and spiritual revitalization in the collective sense. But there was also a diplomatic political strain to Zionism, and that was the one favored by Herzl, who did not live to see the full fruits of the Zionist efforts because he died in 1904. So shortly after, 7 years after founding the Zionist Congress and the Zionist organization, Herzl dies, leaves the scene. But that tradition, the Herzlian tradition, continues, and its chief heir was someone who would go on to become the first president of the State of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, who really focused his efforts on persuading the British as a rising colonial power as the most important partner for Zionism and Zionists to focus their attention on. So as a result of Weizmann's and others' efforts, and for a variety of reasons, some of which are still somewhat unclear, the British government makes a decision in November 1917, just as the British Army is gaining control over Palestine, to issue through its Home Secretary, through its Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, this declaration, which I'll read. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So I'll stop here. Very significant declaration that acknowledges the national nature of the Jewish people. This is in an era in which nationalism is really the currency of the realm. It is the most important form of collective identity. It is closely linked to one's political sense of identity, and it's important because of what will come later. His Majesty's government will use their best efforts to facilitate the achievement of this object, and we have to pause here and say, yes, it recognizes the national nature of the Jewish people, but it calls for a homeland. What it obviously doesn't mention is that which is the ultimate goal for most nationalists, not all, but most nationalists in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is to say the creation of a state. Okay, it's a somewhat vague formulation. National homeland, a home for the Jewish people. Jews know that, Zionists know that the land of Israel is their home. The British add a layer to that by saying, yes, we recognize you as a nation, but withhold their validation of the Zionist aspiration that Herzl had articulated so clearly of a state. But then we get to the second part. I know Hussein is going to say more. I just want to highlight the stunning juxtaposition. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And then goes on to offer a promise of protection for Jews in the diaspora. But that second set of underlined lines, obviously what is so striking is the contrast between national, in the case of the Jews, and civil and religious rights in the case of the local population, which is not referred to by name, but rather in reference to a very small percentage of the total population in Palestine. Just want to add one more thing before I hand over to Hussein. When the first wave of Zionist settlers arrived in Palestine, they encountered a Jewish community of about 25,000 who belonged to what was known as the old Yishuv, the old Jewish community, which regarded the Zionist settlers committed to this new national project with considerable suspicion and concern, lest they upset the very delicate balance that existed within Ottoman Palestine in this time. The Zionist settlers in the early decades of the 20th century are still a small percentage, very small percentage of the overall population of Palestine. And so it is perceived by the local Palestinian population as well as the wider Arab world as a rather stunning insult, almost incomprehensible. And
yeah. No, that's right. I mean, it is worth noting, so this is more your bailiwick, that last bit about the political rights and political status of Jews in any other country reflects, among other things, the fact that the Jews in the cabinet that adopted this did not like it because they thought it threatened assimilation, and they opposed it, which is fascinating. Anyway, what's really worth noting here is, as David was saying, the juxtaposition of the recognition of the Jewish people who are identified by name as a national group with national aspirations and national rights, in a way, to a home. Now, that's not a state, you're right, but it is a something, right? As opposed to the civil and religious rights. Those are individual rights. They're not collective rights. Everybody has civil and religious rights. You have them individually. You don't have them collectively. So automatically, this is not a group. And then secondly, who are they? They are existing non-Jewish communities, right? Not the 97% plus people with a developing identity of their own, but simply not the people in question. And they're not granted a collective identity, they're not granted a name, and they're not granted collective rights, but rather individual rights. And I would say what's fascinating is that's the way it's been ever since, right? In the sense that, you know, how you parse the blame for this is one thing, but the reality is, since then, under the British and after the British left, is the Jews in Palestine, and then Israel and the occupied territories, who have had collective and national expression rights, etc., and the Palestinians who have struggled at most to gain their individual rights and maintain their individual rights, but have not had collective rights. And I think the juxtaposition that's set up here continues to this very day, I would say. Now, what you end up with then, at the end of World War I, is a series of treaties through which the British and the French, in negotiation with Turkey and the new Turkish government, which comes up to repudiate some of the earlier treaties that they thought were unjust, breaking up of much of the Ottoman Empire into mandates, zones of control. And there's essentially a French mandate in Syria, Lebanon, and what might have been an Alawite state in northern Syria, but isn't, and failed to emerge. And so it ends up being all Syria. And a British control in Iraq, and then in Palestine, which for about 3 months maybe even less, about 2.5 months included Jordan, and then a line was drawn to separate Transjordan from the Palestine mandate, which then becomes essentially the definition of Eretz Israel for Jews and Zionists and historical Palestine for Palestinians. It's an indication, by the way, of how modern these areas are. I mean, think of these things as immutable and ancient. They're not. This was defined by some French and British people with pencils, you know, in drawing rooms with snifters of brandy, drawing on maps, and it becomes set in stone, and we can't possibly negotiate over it because Sir Somebody and Monsieur Someone drew that, okay? It's also worth me pointing out at this point, and my father was born in the 30s, and the words either they didn't exist or they didn't mean what they mean now. So the word Israeli didn't exist. There was no such thing as the word Israeli. And the word Palestinian didn't mean the Arabs of Palestine. It meant British institutions in colonial Palestine. So also these immutable identities that we tend to think of as set in stone get formed during this period in a way that reverberates today as if it were immutable. But it really is based on a bunch of contingencies that happen right in this period. And I think...
That's you.
Yeah, all right. So the British mandate over Palestine, which is a UN agreement. League of Nations, excuse me. A League of Nations mandate sort of authorizing Britain to have sovereignty for a limited period of time over Palestine, contains this language drawn from the Balfour Declaration about the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and then a reiteration of this gobbledygook about the civil and religious rights of everybody who isn't Jewish, meaning almost everybody in the country, and protection for Jews elsewhere. What's significant is two things. First of all, that the language of Balfour gets implanted wholesale into the warrant for the British from the League of Nations to exercise this in the context of their sort of colonial role in mandatory Palestine. But at the same time, what we don't have here is the normal preamble in all of the mandatory instruments, all of them that the UN, that the League of Nations gave out at the time, which says that the point of all these mandates is to prepare the local population for self-government and to do absolutely nothing to change the country and to alter and what have you. So uniquely, the League of Nations in Palestine gave Britain two absolutely contradictory jobs: to just prepare the people who are there now for self-government and not to do anything to play around with it, and then at the same time to create this national home for the Jewish people who are almost entirely somewhere else. And as you can see, there's quite a dissonance between those two things.
Okay, we're going to pause for a minute here and engage in a bit of a terminological exercise, something that we're going to do in each of the 4 presentations that we offer. That is to say, we're going to focus on a term of controversy, of contestation that has emerged in recent years. And I want to begin by talking about settler colonialism. So think back to those 2 strands of Zionism that we mentioned.
We have 15 minutes.
Yeah, think back to those 2 strands of Zionism that we mentioned, one of which is the settlement project. And I think it's indisputably the case that Zionists came with the intent of settling the land. The land had a large indigenous population, and what they encountered was decidedly not what some Zionists said, which is to say, a land without a people for a people without a land. It was a land with a people for people in search of a land. Zionists called their efforts colonization. In fact, there was an organization that was established in the early 20th century called the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association. There was a struggle that Zionists engaged in with the local population over the land. It's one of the telltale features of a colonization project. In 1948, we know that in the conflict that we'll end up with discussing today, there was a desire by the Zionist leadership, those who would become the leaders of the State of Israel, to gain as much territory as possible with as small a population of Palestinian Arabs. And I would say that in thinking of settler colonialism, it's important to know where the settlement movement after 1967 fits into the picture, which seems to have intensified the desire to colonize or gain control over as much land as possible with as small a Palestinian population as possible. So I think these are all factors that, sort of argue in favor of the relevance of the term settler colonialism. This is a term that was introduced to distinguish that form of colonialism from what might be called metropole colonialism, which was devoted to the extraction of resources. Settler colonialism was devoted to, as one of its leading scholars, Patrick Wolf, would say, the elimination of indigenous populations.
Belgium and Congo.
Yeah, so there are a couple things to talk about in sort of arguing against the relevance of this term. First of all, do Jews constitute a foreign presence in the land of Israel? Well, Zionists, and I would say arguably, not arguably, I say many Jews, prior to the advent of the Zionist movement, saw the land of Israel, Palestine, as the ancestral homeland. They had deep bonds, emotional bonds to it, and believed that it was the site of their ultimate redemption. And in that sense, regarded themselves, although displaced for centuries and millennia, as indigenous in some sense. Were they a colonial force? They certainly did not represent, in a direct way, a European colonial power. It could be argued that the British intended them to be colonial agents, and that's why we have the Balfour Declaration, but not in the same sense of a direct agent of a colonial power. And here's what I think is most important in arguing against the relevance of this term. So I think there are factors that argue in favor and argue against. And that is that the reduction of Zionism to an ideology of either elimination or control over the land ignores the fact that Zionism was also really an ideology of survival, an ideology of escape, an ideology that offered a solution to the Jewish question as Herzl understood it. As one colleague has called it, an ideology of exitism. And in that regard, I think it's important to say that Zionist settlers faced a degree of peril that many other settler colonialists did not in their home countries. So we can see the balance here, and I know Hussein wants to say.
Yeah, just a couple quick things. I think this is all absolutely correct. I agree with every bit of it. But I would also add that Palestinians have no doubt that, that they've experienced a latter-day colonization, particularly because of the occupation, right? That, I think for Palestinians, you could really have a serious argument, a heartfelt argument about 1948, which they see as dispossession and exile, and yet you could have a really interesting comment. But where it breaks down for Palestinians is two things. Number one, the occupied territories and the settlement movement and the drive towards annexation. And I think people would say that, you know, the savagery of October 7 looks like something from another world. But if you go back to human existence between, say, 1850 and 1960, you saw this all the time, from this kind of savagery from colonized peoples who suddenly rose up, whether it's the Indian Mutiny in 1857, the idea was to kill every European in India, or the Mau Mau, the Boxer Rebellion in China, the idea to kill every European and every Chinese Christian, and even up until the FLN, In Algeria, it began the big war with a horrendous massacre in the mountains of Algeria. We haven't seen it for a long time. This is not to excuse anything. It's just to say that for Palestinians, there isn't much doubt, just as I think for Israelis recoil at the term because it's become a pejorative in the era of decolonization, right? So it just sounds like an insult rather than a possibly useful term. And the only other thing worth mentioning is for Palestinians also the kind of housing discrimination, lived discrimination, the fact that Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews live separately. There are very few mixed areas. There are a few mixed cities, but basically they live separately because Palestinians can't move into Jewish areas, and all the services that flow from that reinforces the idea that this is, in fact, the remnant of a colonial project with everything that goes with that. Oh, yeah, sorry. Right. So, actually, this is you. Yeah.
Okay, so the local Arab population greets the Balfour Declaration with very considerable outrage and denunciation.
Mourning. People hung up black flags,
And there are outbreaks of violence as tensions rise between these two groups. So you have sort of the British overlords emerging on the scene, trying to play referee, sometimes casting their hand on one side of the scale, sometimes less frequently on the other, but nonetheless trying to determine what's in their best interests as they're contending with these two groups that are now really beginning to face off against one another with growing intensity. Violence breaks out in 1920-21 between Arabs and Jews. The prominent Zionist author Yosef Chaim Brenner is killed in the anti-Jewish riots that break out in this period. And tensions continue throughout the 1920s, reaching really a peak in the year 1929, in the summer of 1929, over what is perhaps the most contested piece of real estate in the world, the Haram al-Sharif, the site that Muslims regard as the third holiest site in their religion, the site that Jews regard as the remnants of the destroyed Second Holy Temple. We have agitators on both sides contributing to the rise of tensions between the two groups. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, contributes his fair share. Jewish nationalists, especially those of the right-wing revisionist strain, contribute their share. And there is a very profound outbreak of violence in August 1929. Begins with riots of the Arab population directed against the Jewish population. Entire communities of Jews, as in the holy city of Hebron, are eliminated. And the British are somewhat dilatory in responding, but when they do, they come down hard on the Arab population. And this moment, 1929, is a significant turning point in the history of the conflict. For one thing, for Jews on the ground, committed to the Zionist project, this becomes a clear indication that the goal of Zionism must be not simply the creation of a Jewish state, but a Jewish majority.
It's the beginning of the armed conflict, really.
It really introduces us into, although the 20s had very considerable rates of violence, we move now into a far more violent moment in the conflict. And I think you were going to take this.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So what we have here is the parties taking different roles, right? So you've got in mandatory Palestine now, in this atmosphere of tension, of competing and irreconcilable claims, of British uncertainty about what's in their interests. They're committed to Zionism in a way, but then they're not really sure what that means, and they haven't really committed themselves to any specific outcome. They're not sure. The British look at this as an opportunity to expand their empire and assert their interests in the Middle East, but I think it backfires on them rather badly, and they end up, as they did in many parts of the world, biting off much more than they could chew, especially once they got involved in World War II. The Arabs in Palestine, seeing the colonial usurpation of their land with Jews as the vanguard and really by Jews, and starting to realize two things. First of all, that this really is a concerted project that's not a pipe dream at all, but that has every chance of success. And they're amazed by that. And they don't quite know what to do about it because they're not ready for it. It just is happening around them, to them. And as they're understanding it, it's happening. They're not ready for it at all. And on the other hand, I think they're also coming in this period to view themselves as Palestinians, right? Because in the earlier period, before World War I, they started increasingly viewing themselves as Arabs more than Ottoman subjects. And then they sort of saw themselves as Arab nationalists, but not as Palestinians. I think they wanted to belong to something bigger than just Palestine. I think they had a very strong emotional reaction to the first pan-Arab state founded by Emir Faisal in Syria in the 1920s, but it was crushed very quickly by the French, and the French, sort of put down those barriers. And I think by the mid-20s, the Palestinians the Arabs in Palestine started to realize they're on their own. They're not going to get help from anybody else. And whatever they experience is going to increasingly bind them together and distinguish them from other Arabs. In other words, they're becoming Palestinians. The great inflection point there is the Nakba, which is something they alone experienced, and we'll talk about that later, but it's beginning now. And finally, the Zionists, the Jewish settlers in Palestine, seeing the affirmation of the legal grounding for their cause in international law, in the global legitimacy that's being established in the wake of World War I, of all the instruments and treaties, of legality, of order, of the birth of human rights, and of the self-determination. And they're seeing their cause reflected in all of that, and gaining confidence with every event that happens, pretty much, because they're growing stronger. And now, this is a quick, I'm not going to belabor the statistics, but you can see how, beginning in 1851, there's 13,000 Jews and 320,000 basically Arab, Palestinian Muslims and Christians. And the ratios go ebb and flow, but you still have this enormous lopsidedness by 1945. And 1948, you've got 1,300,000+ Palestinians and 650,000 Jews in what was to become the Israel and the occupied territories. And this, I think it's important to understand here, is what this does is it underscores, this demographic is the key to understanding Palestinian unwillingness to engage in discussions on partition, to engage in discussions about compromise with this small minority. It keeps growing, but it's still a small minority, which wants to claim half the land, 55% of the land, the best part of the land, actually, according to the UN partition plan, et cetera. It bolsters their determination to resist, right? I think that's really important. What happens next is what began as a general strike against the British in 1936 by the Arabs, who were just, at this point, completely fed up with what they saw as the increasing inevitability of the loss of their country to this, what they regarded as an alien and usurping colonial force. And they blamed the British for it because the British were in charge. And they started a general strike, which became violent very quickly, and it led to a generalized uprising. And the Palestinians, as I said, they weren't ready for this fight. And what they did was they did an uprising against the British, which was both too little, too late to stop what was happening, and it was also too much, too soon to actually be useful. So what it ended up doing was destroying their burgeoning national movement before it had to really come into play after World War II. You had 5,000 Palestinians killed, 10,000 wounded, 6,000 detained. Almost all the major Palestinian leaders were either killed, imprisoned, or exiled to Madagascar and places like that. Their burgeoning little national institutions were broken up. Their militias were destroyed. The British worked in concert with Jewish militias to achieve this. And the Palestinian national movement emerged from this war with the British, totally decimated, its leadership gone, its men killed or captured, its weapons seized. The Jewish groups came out stronger than ever and are working mostly in league with the British at this point. And it really sets up a bad situation for the Arabs of Palestine. However, you do have the Peel Commission, which reflects the failing mandate, which starts to talk about partition and puts that into play. And then the MacDonald White Paper, which committed the British to limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine. But actually they committed to limiting it, but if you look at the statistics, it never really slowed down in practice. I'm not saying they didn't want to try. I'm saying they didn't succeed, if they did.
Okay, as we move into the 1940s, we see not only the intensification of tensions between Jews and Arabs on the ground, but we see an increasingly dire predicament for Jews in Europe. This is Adolf Hitler assumes power in 1933. The Second World War begins in September 1939. The situation that Jews face in Europe is exceptionally dire, which adds a degree of existential urgency to the Zionist cause. Zionists come to understand that they too must somehow, they must include in their efforts the possibility of offering a place of refuge to the Jews of Europe. It's a very large question about how much the Zionist movement actually did to contribute to that, but that certainly was part of the rhetoric and the sensibility of many Zionists. So you have these two sources of tension, the internal tensions within Palestine and the increasing sense of urgency weighing upon the Zionist movement, which helps us understand why the 40s are such an intense period. We see the emergence of new strains within the Zionist world in Palestine, new paramilitary groups that reject what is seen as the accommodationist line of the mainstream Haganah associated with the labor Zionist movement, accommodationist, that is to say, with the British, who disappointed Zionists both in the wake of the 1929 violence by imposing new immigration restrictions, and then again in the wake of the Peel Commission rejection by again issuing a white paper that imposed immigration restrictions. The new paramilitary groups that emerge within the Zionist world in Palestine reject the putative accommodation of the Haganah, of sort of the mainstream group associated with the labor Zionist movement, and undertake acts of violence against the Arab population, against their political opponents within the Jewish world, and against British and other international officials through acts of assassination. Especially a group known as the Stern Gang, or Lechi, Lochmei Cherut Israel, Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, who in the 1940s engage in political assassinations of international figures who they believe have betrayed the Zionist movement. In response to this new activism, the mainstream Haganah actually engages in 1944 in a period that is known somewhat infamously in Zionist history as the Season, in which they collaborate with the British to track down and bring to justice other Zionist paramilitary activists. One of the groups that rejects the accommodationist line of the Haganah, other than the Lechi game, much more central and important to Zionist history, the National Military Organization, with which Menachem Begin was very closely identified, the Agun Tzvai Leumi, actually blows up the military and administrative headquarters of the British Mandate at the King David Hotel in the summer of 1946, delivering a very powerful blow to the British, who by this point had really wearied of the violence amongst all of the parties in this very complicated triangle, and which perhaps prompted the British, certainly lent new energy to the British desire to exit Palestine as the administrative overlord and to surrender authority to the newly created United Nations. The United Nations created a special committee to investigate the problem of Palestine and what its disposition should be. That special committee, which began working in May 1947, issued a report in the fall of 1947, which was put before the United Nations General Assembly in November for consideration. And the proposal was the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. The United Nations General Assembly voted in favor of that plan, and as Hussein suggested, the plan proposed to give 55% of the land of Palestine to 1/3 of the population. Remember, as Hussein mentioned, in this period in time, the Palestinian Arab population was 1.3 million, the Jewish population was 650,000. This is one reason why the Palestinian side rejected the partition plan.
Also, within that gerrymandered thing, there's no Jewish majority. It was not possible to gerrymander a Jewish majority area in Palestine at that time.
Just want to add one historical point. We talked about this in the case of the Balfour Declaration. In Balfour, in the Peel Commission report, and again in the UN partition plan, the Arab side was not just insulted by the proposal, but in many respects taken by surprise by the clear favoritism, as they saw it, of the Zionist project by international actors. So I think this is important in understanding sort of the depth of enmity and miscomprehension, misunderstanding that inform both sides.
The national movement remains surprised to this day. Every time it happens, they remain surprised.
Remain surprised to this
Yes.
day. Okay. We're going to conclude with this slide, and then we'll open for questions. And this is the culminating year of the first part of our conversation together with you, which is the year 1948. After the United Nations General Assembly vote, Arab irregulars begin to attack Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem. This is early December, actually late November, early December 1947. One thing that we see occurring in the early months of 1948, as they anticipate a major conflagration on the ground, is Arab elites, urban elites, begin to leave the country for safer parts.
Some expulsions begin too.
And then we have the articulation in March 1948 of what is known as Plan D, which is an operational plan given to the Haganah that allows for the pacification of potentially violent or contentious parts of the land through a variety of means, including expulsion. On April 9th, 1948, the Irgun that we mentioned before, responsible for the King David Hotel bomb blast, undertakes a massacre in the Jerusalem suburb of Deir Yassin, which exercises a tremendous psychological effect on the local Palestinian Arab population, inducing deep fear and expediting the currents of flight from Palestine. In response, Palestinian militants undertake an attack on a convoy going to the Hadassah Medical Facility at Mount Scopus, in which some 80 people are killed. And we have sort of in this period cycles of violence, but a clear direction whereby the Jewish side is gaining more and more control over the battle after some very contentious battles in the early months of 1948. On the 14th of May, just as the British mandate is about to expire, the leaders of the Zionist movement formally declare the creation of the State of Israel. The next day, this new state is attacked by surrounding Arab armies, which the forces of the new State of Israel managed to repel and gain new territories for their nascent state. And what's most important to end with, of course, leave the last word for Hussein, is the extent to which we see the two narratives and national trajectories of these people operate in parallel but move in opposite directions. So the Jewish story, the Zionist story, is a movement from exile to homeland, and the Palestinian story is the story of the movement from homeland to exile. It is for this reason that 1948 bears such radically divergent names. For the Zionist side, 1948 is the year of liberation and independence, and for the Palestinian side, it is the year of catastrophe, or Nakba.
Yeah. No,
Final.
Just a couple of quick words. I mean, that sums up things very nicely. Just a few little things. One is the picture, right? I mean, that's Gaza today. I mean, that's people going from the north to the south, now the south to the east, the west. That's why it's so iconic, right? The key was and it still is sort of one of the key national symbols of the Palestinian movement. Why? Because the Palestinians who fled, or even those who were exiled, in 1947 and 48, from what they considered a dangerous war zone, never, and I've been surrounded by Palestinians my entire life. I've talked to so many. Every one of them said they expected to go home in a matter of weeks. They never imagined they wouldn't go. I mean, of course they were going to go home. They're just getting out of the way of these armies, and then they're going to go home. Whatever happens, whoever wins is not the point. The point is they go back to their villages. Well, no. And that's certainly not what happened. The other thing I think worth noting is this is the inflection point that creates the Palestinian identity firmly. No other Arab population went through this. It's what makes Palestinians Palestinian and what makes other Arabs not Palestinians. So it's not, it's no longer possible to say the Arabs of Palestine as if it was just, a kind of random agglomeration of Arabs. No, it's a people who've been through some things, as Mr. Trump would have said, been through some things. And the last thing I'll say is the Nakba doesn't simply mean that the majority of the 80% of the Arabs who lived in what became the State of Israel were displaced permanently. It's that there was a society there. There was a society, and it wasn't fully independent. It was still coming out of its post-colonial shell. It was still coming into modernity, but it was a coherent society. In 1947, there was a coherent Palestinian society, and by May 1948, there wasn't. Like, it was gone. And that's what the Nakba really is. It's not so much like I had to leave my home and so did all my friends. It's like we had a society, and then we didn't. That's the Nakba. Anyway.
Okay. Just a final program note. What we are going to take up in our next conversation will be the story of the fledgling State of Israel, which was seen by many of its citizens, Jewish citizens, as the fulfillment of a millennial dream, especially important in the wake of the Holocaust, and the predicament of this newly dispossessed people who come to be known as Palestinians, for whom the Nakba is such an anchoring event in their conscience.
For 20 years.
And we're going to talk about the birth and then almost immediate disappearance.
From 1948 to 1968, they exited the stage of history because they had no institutions.
That awaits you in our next conversation. Thank you so much for your attention. We can move on.
Okay.
There's a timeline,
Okay.
and we had some final questions, but
Well,
we can incorporate.
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so we do have some questions through that, so I'm going to field them as they come in. Given the complex history that deals with the British colonial politics, the existing populations, the populations that are coming, the question is about the term colonial settler colonialism, whether it you complicated it, but whether it does in fact apply to Israel as it is now. And a follow-up to that is, given how polarizing some of those terms are, whether it is applicable and whether there are other ways to discuss the history and the reality.
Yeah.
I have a couple of thoughts about that, if I might. I mean, one is, look, when you talk about, the problem with discussing anything about Israel is, are you talking about Israel as it is internationally accepted in its pre-1967 borders? Or are you talking about the de facto Israeli state that's existed since 1967? That's a really, it would be Israel and the occupied territories. It's a really important question, because it would be very hard, I think, to describe in any meaningful sense Israel inside its international borders as a settler colonial state in a deep, meaningful way, because most Israelis have been born into it. They're not settlers. They're born into being Jewish Israelis. There are remnants of the colonial nature in the housing discrimination of almost apartheid in Israel, where populations in most places don't mix and cannot mix, right? Palestinians cannot move into most areas of Israel, practically speaking, through a combination of law and regulation. That's a remnant of the colonial nature, and it's a really important one. But if you look at the occupied territories, I don't see how you could describe it as anything other than colonial and settlers. They are literally settlers, and they are engaged in a colonial project. Now, how do we distinguish between the state of Israel, in which people are born into it and they're not settlers, and it only has remnants of settler colonialism in it, and the project that it's pursuing with all its might in the West Bank? How do we disentangle those things? I don't think we can. I think what we're left with is a situation in which there are ways in which Israel fits the definition to a T and uniquely in the world today. Which is the only place in which this kind of settler colonialism is going on is in the occupied territories. But on the other hand, where it doesn't fit it in many other ways, is it useful? My last point is this. I don't really like these debates, and I've always sort of preached against the use of the term apartheid, even to describe the occupied territories, which in a way is worse than old South Africa, in a way better. But the point is, I don't want to have a debate about an analogy, because an analogy is weak. It's always weak. Well, this is not South Africa. This is something different. Okay. So are we really going to debate the virtue of this analogy? Are we going to debate this word and its definition, its etymology and its meaning, international law, or are we making a historical analogy? This is all rubbish. What we need to do is have a conversation about realities of daily living and the realities of life that shape this conflict and make it go on and on and on. That's what we need to talk about, not a debate about history and etymology and taxonomy. I really think people are very stupid to fall into that trap.
I'm just going to add a word to that. As I tried to suggest in the slide that I presented, I think there are reasons, as Hussein suggested, why this designation is fitting. I went back and read, in thinking about this term, some of the essays of the person entrusted by the Zionist movement in the first decade of the 20th century with land colonization, land settlement, a Prussian Jew by the name of Arthur Rupin. And he refers to, in his various languages that I read him in, he refers to the communities established as colonies, He refers to the project as colonization. And he also refers in Hebrew to the colonizers as mityashvim, settlers. So I mean, I think a strong case could be made that they're settlers who are seeking to colonize. What I think the danger is the formulaic and one-dimensional nature and the imputation of a single mission or goal to settler colonialism, all forms of settler colonialism. Right. And that is the project of eliminationism. The project of eliminationism. That's what really stands at the heart, according to Wolff's and others' use of the term. I don't think it's entirely accurate. It's not altogether inaccurate, but it's not entirely accurate to reduce the Zionist movement to a project of eliminationism. It's, I think, much more complicated than that. And that's something, and here I agree with Hussein, that terms such as settler colonialism are not built for. They're not built for exceptions to the rule, to deviations, to historical nuances. And thus one must use the term, I think, with very considerable caution, which is, alas, all too often absent.
I mean, I think they become caricatures very quickly. And that's my biggest problem, yeah.
So another, we're not taking questions from the floor just because we don't have time for that. So
we're happy to stick around.
Yeah, we'll stick around. Yeah. So another term that is obviously fraught right now is anti-Zionism, but can you discuss anti-Zionism in this period? That is before 1948.
In this period, it's meaningful. So my feeling about Zionism is after 1948, it becomes increasingly less meaningful because you're not really talking about a transnational Zionist movement as the main antagonist for the Palestinian national movement. You're talking about the state of Israel with its population increasingly born into it, as I say. And so I get very weary of discussions of Zionism because we are so far now beyond the transnational Zionist movement being the centerpiece. Now, it's really interesting that Israel's most vocal opponents like to have a debate about Zionism, and so does the Israeli far right. The whole discussion of the nation-state law in Israel and the home of the Jewish people is all these definitive articles that make little sense to me. A person who clings to the idea of Zionism is Netanyahu. He loves to discuss Zionism, and so do his worst antagonists. But for me, I'd like to talk about the state of Israel and its policies and the Palestinian national movement and its different iterations, and not get stuck in a question of ideology that is a remnant of the past, because the Zionist movement realized its goal in 1948. And now we have the Israeli state, and that's the primary actor.
I largely agree with Hussein, but I'm going to add some historical nuance to the question. First of all, I would encourage you all to take a listen to Congressman Jerry Nadler's statement on this from the floor of the Congress just a couple of days ago. It was like a kind of stunningly informed nuanced historical perspective on anti-Zionism. And what he noted is anti-Zionism has a long history amongst Jews.
Yeah.
So what I want to call your attention to is the following. Between the 1880s, certainly 1897, and 1933, 1939, we have a period that might be called the golden age of Jewish ideology. We have a huge range of ideological perspectives, including many variants of Jewish nationalism, a fair number of which are non-statist. That is to say, their intended goal is not the creation of a state, but the creation of, very often, a cultural enclave that has not sovereignty but autonomy, the right to regulate its own education, its own use of language, its own cultural institutions. This is a strain of Jewish nationalism that sees itself in opposition to Zionism. And within this crowded marketplace of ideas, we also see a good number of those who are opposed to Zionism as their chief target. This is a current principally found amongst traditionally observant, ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews, for whom anti-Zionism is constitutive to their very sense of identity. We have here in the front row some experts in this particular version of Judaism. So it would be a mistake, I think, to fail to understand the presence of anti-Zionism within 20th century Jewish history. And I think it would be a mistake to assume, as a result of that, that anti-Zionism as it manifests today cannot be anti-Semitic. It can be.
It can be.
It needn't be, but it can be. And that's really the subject for a whole other lecture.
One thing worth pointing out as an addendum is anyone who is categorically anti-nationalism is also going to be anti-Zionist. And there are people who just do not like nationalism in any form and therefore object to Zionism, who are not being anti-Semitic at all. They're equal opportunity rejectors. And I think they're often mistaken for anti-Semites.
And I will also add a historical note that there was also a strain of anti-Zionism within the British society in the context of the colonial taking over of Palestine, mandate Palestine, and from both the left and the right, the anti-colonial left, and from the right, that is, they didn't want to spend imperial and British money on a Jewish project in Palestine. So there was also a difference, right?
Absolutely right.
I think we have time for one more question, and it's a sort of a legal question of land ownership. That is, on your slide, it's, the quote is, Palestinian Arabs see the colonial usurpation of their land. But effectively, who owned the land? What was the land theirs, or was it ruled by the Ottomans? So what's the issue of land ownership at the time?
That's a good question. In 1948, there's a distinction between public lands, not owned by anyone, but therefore controlled by the British, or before them, the Ottomans, the Vilayat of whatever it was, which were very large amounts of territory, and privately held land. The privately held land in mandatory Palestine in 1948, I believe, was 93% owned by Arabs.
7% Jewish, yeah.
Sorry?
7% Jewish, yeah.
7% Jewish, 93% Arab, that's right. But you also have a large part of the, lots of land that was not owned by anyone. Much of this land, the 93% and the publicly owned land, gets transferred to Israeli institutions, both governmental and transnational, actually. In the case of the Jewish National Fund, I believe it is, and administered by the Israel Land Authority, which is, there's where Zionism comes back in, right? Because the Jewish National Fund owns most of the land in Israel, not in the name of the Israeli state, but in the name of the Jewish people. And that's why Arabs can move in to most of these neighborhoods, because the Israel Land Authority, which administers those lands, interprets that as prohibiting them from giving long-term leases to people who aren't Jewish. I think that's a very interesting remnant of transnational Zionism that persists to this day, in the sense that the ownership claims to almost all the land in Israel is transcendent of the state of Israel in the opinion of the Jewish National Fund.
Yep. I'll just say a few historical notes. The Zionist movement established in the person of the aforementioned Arthur Rupin in 1908 the Palestine office of the Zionist organization, whose mission was to purchase land for Zionist settlement. Those from whom it tended to buy land were often wealthy absentee landowners, people who had land holdings in Palestine, known as the Effendi class, who often lived in Beirut, Cairo, Damascus. People like Hussein's ancestors. The sale of land by that wealthy absentee owner class became more and more controversial over the course of the 1920s and 30s, because those who lost out were the rural Palestinian farmers, tenant farmers, who had no say in the disposition of the land, and who, as a Palestinian national identity is beginning to emerge, already we can see traces in the 1920s, feel that this is a national betrayal, not just a betrayal of their own source of livelihood. So it's important to recognize that dynamic and the centrality of the Zionist project of purchasing land to settle and gain control over land and to engage in the work of rehabilitation of the Jewish national body as they saw it. Just a final note about what Hussein was mentioning. Indeed, in the wake of the 1948 war, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, passes a number of laws that essentially allow for the transfer of property on which there is no resident population to the control of the state. Absentee property laws and the creation of a custodianship to regulate that land. And that entails the absorption of thousands and thousands of dunams of Palestinian land into state holdings. The state, together with the Jewish National Fund, established in the first decade of the 20th century, whose charter says its mission is to ensure control of land in the name of the Jewish people, is JNF and the state land comprised until recent years of something like 95, 93% of all land in the state. That's begun to change over the last 20 years or so, but still a very large percentage of the land of the state is controlled by those institutions, the state and the JNF. This is part of the reason why, if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, it's hard to grow your household in physical terms by expanding your property holdings or even building. So this is an issue of very considerable concern to particularly Palestinian citizens of Israel who are the legatees, the heirs of that tradition of Jewish control over the land and who in some sense still suffer its consequences.
There is also the remarkable category of present absentees. In other words, Palestinian landowners who were not in their villages at the time of the cessation of hostilities, who were deemed to be subject to expropriation because they were not in their villages. So they are present, and so they became Israeli citizens, but they were absentees, so they lost their property.
Yeah, they're
present absentees is a remarkable concept.
Internally displaced persons who go by the haunting Israeli term of present absentees, about for whom a law was written that basically said if they were not present on their land from a certain period, not only would they not be entitled to return to it, but they would not be entitled to receive citizenship. This was the nationality law of 1952. Anyway, this takes us a bit far afield, but what is important to note, I think, is that land and ownership of it are really essential features of the conflict.
Little details like that still burn in the Palestinian narrative. That's the present absentee thing galls, I have to say. To an Israeli point of view, it probably sounds like a weird footnote, but from a Palestinian narrative, it's like a burning ember in the foot.
And I'm sure we'll hear more about it in January. And the next two sessions will be online, will be webinars, and then the final session will gather again here in this room in March. So thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us online, and we'll continue. And we will send you some more reading references for you to continue to learn. Thank you for joining us.
By the way, no one can catch this. I've had it for 8 weeks.